from K4 to 12th grade. So it wasn't just something that was in the background, but it was very much my nearly daily life. So the school had a lot of rules, like no dancing, no playing cards. You could play like Rook and Uno, but not like poker is what they meant. We weren't supposed to listen to secular music. We weren't supposed to go to movies. There were a lot of things that, of course, they didn't really keep track of, but they were in the student handbook. We had a very specific dress code. Men got to be a little more comfortable than women. And one of the things that stood out to me that really, I think, in a lot of ways, started my process of questioning where I was in faith was we had, now it's Winston-Salem, which doesn't get that cold compared to here. But there was one year when it did, and the heater broke. So we all still had to come to school. And the dress code was that women had to wear skirts no higher than the top of the knee and no pants. So some girls got creative because they're like, we're going to be in an unheated building. So they wore ankle-length skirts and put long johns underneath. Somebody caught sight of the long johns one time when somebody crossed their legs. They all got demerits because they were wearing pants. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. And I don't think I had the theological acumen to put it together at that time. But I think if I did, I would have been like, Sabbath was created for humanity and not humanity the Sabbath. Like, this is kind of a stupid rule. These are just people who are trying to take care of themselves. They're not even trying to break a rule. Like, they wore ankle-length skirts to try to maintain what's really kind of a stupid rule. My church didn't even have this dress code, and we went to a fundamentalist church. So that's kind of like the kind of surfacey side of fundamentalism. The other part is we were King James Version only. We believed the Bible literally, except when we didn't. Nobody talked about that part. And when we had revivals, they were almost always about the end of the world. And so that was kind of my context. In the middle of that, I decided to rebel. Now, my mom had rebelled quite a bit. I would only find this out how far her rebellion went later in life. But my grandparents, her parents, were my primary caregivers. In fact, ultimately ended up adopting me for tax reasons. But they ended up adopting me. And so there it was, and I decided I was going to rebel. I guess because I am the child of my parent, right? And so I decided my rebellion was going to be Dungeons and Dragons. I was going to be a nerd that played what is now a very popular hobby. And so off I went. And my grandparents were okay with that. And when they got questioned about it, their answer was always, we know where he is. Later, I would find out the problem with my mom was like they often did not know where she was. And so it's like, we at least know where he is. We know what he's doing. And so this was in the middle of what they called the Satanic Panic. That's when, especially for fundamentalist churches, like we weren't buying gas from Exxon or Texaco. If you remember those gas stations, Texaco had the star with a circle around it. And if you squinted hard enough, it looked like a pentagram and things like that. Exxon, because it had two X's that were stylized in it, which was a double cross, and therefore they were also in on this like satanic cabal. A lot of stuff that I hear in popular culture kind of reasserting itself in ways about like these hidden agendas. We were very much into that. We were trying to boycott Procter & Gamble. If you ever try to do that, you will find that is impossible. Procter & Gamble owns everything that has to do with maintaining your cleanliness. Again, all because of the symbol that they had, which they no longer have. Now that's also, I think, when Amway got started. It was kind of trying to get out from underneath that. So King James only were fighting the kind of like these weird culture wars that didn't really exist. And there I am with my rebellion of I'm going to play this game that that I shouldn't be playing. And they found out, my school found out I was playing, so I got sent to the principal's office. And I was given a lot of books to read about how dangerous this game is. And so I went home, I read them, I had to go back to the principal's office a week later. And I was asked, did you read them? I said, yes. What do you think? And I said, I think that they can't even get the rules of the game right. And therefore, I don't really trust them on anything else. That last part started sticking with me on all kinds of things I was told were not right with God. I'm like, if they didn't get the game right, I mean, all you have to do is open the book. It's at the very beginning of like what the stats for a character are. They couldn't get that right. It's on the character sheet. You don't even have to read the book. It's just on the back of the book. They couldn't get that part right. So why should I trust them with anything else? And then, approaching the age of 16, I began to notice I was different. I couldn't exactly articulate it, but I knew there was something different about me than the rest of my classmates, really, except maybe for one or two people who I later found out were also gay. And the horror of being gay was drilled into us when our school principal was arrested for soliciting sex from an undercover officer in the men's room of one of the parks. And that just kind of created a paradigm for my thinking that kept me away from really wrestling with who I was. And so in the middle of all of that, I knew there was something wrong with me. And by the time I was 16, I remember laying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, with hours passing by, and I was trying to imagine what it would feel like to be on fire, and then to imagine what that would feel like to experience that forever. This is not something a 16-year-old should be doing when they're trying to go to sleep. I now think that's spiritual abuse. And so, one of the dangers, quote unquote, of playing Dungeons and Dragons is I made friends who were not fundamentalists. Who were still Christians. One was Roman Catholic, and one was Moravian. You may not know, here you might know Moravians, but a lot of places I go, they don't know who Moravians are. Moravians are just like low church Lutherans. And they're really cool. They even teach the small catechism, like the Lutheran small catechism. That's how very much a Lutheran they are. And we're in full communion with them and have been for a long time in a variety of ways. And the only place that you can find Moravians in any large number is around the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania area, kind of down into here a little bit, and Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which was an original Moravian colony. It's where their archives are. There are probably almost as many Moravian churches in Winston-Salem as there are Baptist churches, and that's unusual for North Carolina in general. So I made friends, and then the Roman Catholic, who was a little older than the rest of us, he got married. And he invited us all to his wedding. And so there I was, a fundamentalist who had been told that all Catholics are actually secretly Satanists. Many of them don't know it, and the worst of them are the Jesuits. This is literally what I was told. If you know anything about Catholicism, the Jesuits are probably the least likely to actually be Satanists. I don't think any of them are, but that's the whole thing, right? So that's what I was told. So here I am in this Catholic church. I describe it now, I didn't know this then, but I describe it now as a very post-Vatican II Catholic church. If you grew up in Catholicism, you kind of know what I mean. They are more relaxed about being Catholic in the right ways, and very invested in being Catholic in the best ways. So here I am in this very modern church with this enormous baptismal font at the back. Again, it's a post-Vatican II kind of thing. The bride's family was Baptist, and the groom's family was Catholic, so they did a non-Eucharist wedding. There are two things I remember about this service, and one was the Knights of Columbus were there. And if you've ever seen them in a ritual setting, you know, it's the hats with the plumes and the swords and everything. And as a D&D nerd, that was really cool. But the other thing that stood out was the gospel reading. And after the priest finished reading the gospel, which I think was the wedding at Cana, that would make sense, he kissed the book, closed it, and put it down. That one ritual action communicated to me that this person thought what they had done was very important in a way that all the rhetoric of fundamentalist talk about the Bible did not communicate to me. Clearly, the priest thought reading scripture was very important. And I thought these guys were supposed to be Satanists. And he's clearly not. So and then The Exorcist was televised on TV. And I remember I did the thing you're not supposed to do as a fundamentalist, and I went to Sunday school, and I asked a question. If they're all Satanists, why is the exorcisms working? Like why do they even bother? And I was basically told, don't ask that question. I also started developing what I would later learn were very Lutheran questions. If the Eucharist is merely symbolic, why is Paul so worried that it might kill people? You know, symbols don't normally kill people unless it's a statue that falls on you. That's my teenage question, right? And again, I was told, don't ask these questions. What I was learning from all of that was I found something attractive about worship in that Catholic church that I was not experiencing in my own. Because I was reading the Bible, and I was experiencing in the Bible like these descriptions of worship in the temple that did not make sense of my experience of worship on Sunday morning, which was having a man yell at me for 45 minutes about how I needed to get my life right. And I felt like something was off. So at this fundamentalist school I was at, there were two people there. One was my favorite teacher. She was my fourth grade teacher. She retired from teaching and started working in the cafeteria, so I got to see her all the time. I later found out she was the wife of a Lutheran pastor. I don't know how she got this job, because there is a screening process where they ask you all these theological questions, and you have to get through that in order to get hired. There's also another teacher who, for some reason, this school hired somebody to teach classical Latin. And that's the foreign language that I opted for because of a D&D nerd, right? French isn't going to help me. I need Latin so I can do all the cool stuff, right? So I took this classical Latin class. As it turned out, she was Presbyterian, also managed to get through the screening process. And so she signed us up for a foreign arts language festival. And I thought, okay, I'll go to that. So I signed up for it. As it turned out, she signed us up not at Bob Jones University, which is where all our textbooks came from, very fundamentalist kind of institute, kind of like Liberty University. It wasn't there. It was at this place I'd never heard of before called Lenore, which is an ELCA, at the time probably LCA, the ELCA existed yet, an LCA university in Western North Carolina. So we went there, and the wisdom that God had given her, she made us go to chapel. I don't know what she was thinking, but I would like to think she was thinking maybe this will be the first time these poor fundamentalist kids get to hear the gospel. So she marched us into the auditorium. We were sitting there. She was right next to me. Mind you, I had this experience with Roman Catholicism. I was a little enthralled, but also scared because of what I'd been told. And in the background, also, there's that question. They got the character sheet wrong about D&D. Maybe they're not getting other things right either. The pastor walks out in front of the assembly and says, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, wearing something like this. My head whipped over to her and said, are they Catholic? She said, no, they're Lutherans. Oh. We sang a Mighty Fortress once in choir, so I filed that away. I ended up going to a Southern Baptist university. Now, if you're not familiar with fundamentalism, here's the basic rule. If it's not Baptist, it's evil. If it's Southern Baptist, it might be evil, so be careful. Sometimes they ordain women. So I went down, they had a whole shelf, maybe two, of Luther and Lutheranism. I checked all the books out. I don't know what I was reading, but what I remember is whatever I was reading, it had a quote from Luther in it. Now, let me back up a moment and say, in the midst of all of this, I began wondering, do I have enough faith? Like, I never had the conversion experience that I see everybody going through when they go through while we're singing the first verse of Just As I Am over and over and over and over and over until the pastor feels like enough people have come forward for them to say I've done a good job. Sorry, I'm being a little cynical, but that's what it felt like. And I, despite being raised in a fundamentalist family, my grandparents were really good at doing catechesis even though they didn't know it. I was raised in the faith. I did not have a moment in my life that I thought I need to start believing. I just felt like I always had. And I knew a lot of my friends were giving into the peer pressure, and they were kind of faking a conversion experience so they could go forward and get out from under the pressure to have this experience. And I never did. But I began to wonder, I've never had that experience. Am I really a believer? Do I believe enough that God counts me as okay? Especially since I have this other thing lingering in the back of my head that says I should not fit in. Because like Catholics, they told me I couldn't fit in. And so I really began to wonder, and I kept praying, God changed me, both as somebody who has more faith and doesn't have this sensibility in the back of my head about who in my class I might like. And nothing changed. So there I am, reading a book about Luther and Lutheranism. And it gets to a part about faith. And it says, can you have enough faith? Luther says, no, you can't. You will never have enough faith. That's why you have to trust in God. Because it's not something you do, it's something that God does. And I was like, oh, that's different. So I kept reading. I eventually attended my first Lutheran congregation outside of Winston-Salem, where my favorite teacher went. It's a small, tiny, rural congregation. We were probably half of the people. My family went with me. We were half of the congregation that day. We made the mistake of sitting in the front, So we were sitting when everybody else was standing, we were standing when everybody else was sitting. And the entire time we're looking up at the headboard going, what is Epiphany? No, sorry, that's not how I said it. I said, what's an epiphany? We figured out it must be somewhat connected to Christmas because the math about the weeks worked out. But I remember there were crosses everywhere in the sanctuary. They had these lanterns, and each facing of the lantern had a cross on it. You couldn't look anywhere and not see the cross. As a fundamentalist, you don't have images in your worship space unless it's a really bad painting of the River Jordan behind the baptistry. That's about it. And so here I am surrounded by symbols of faith in the middle of a beautiful kind of country Lutheran liturgy. And it just felt right. Because we were instructed in the faith that day. He didn't yell at us for 45 minutes. And it felt like the kind of worship that I read in the Bible. Orthodox Christians tend not to read the book of Revelation in their cycle of reading. And if you ask them why, the answer is often something like this: because you don't read the instructions out loud. For them, the book of Revelation is all about how to do the liturgy. And while this was not, it's a small church, so it's not as formal as a lot of other churches. It certainly wasn't as formal as the Catholic Church, but it still felt like that. They were doing worship. The point of being there was not about getting our life right with God. The point of being there was to encounter God. And I was set free. I decided I'm leaving this. I'm going to go find a Lutheran church. And there's this really weird looking Lutheran church. I mean that in the best way. There's a really weird looking, it's built in the 70s, right? So it looks like one of those. And it was on the way to the mall in Winston-Salem, so we always drove by it. It's the Lutheran Church of the Epiphany. I'm like, I'm going to go there because I want to see the inside of this weird church. And again, I fell in love. Same thing that I experienced in this country church was there. It's shaped. If you go on Google Maps and look for it, it's shaped like a star because it's the Lutheran Church of the Epiphany. And so the inside's kind of funky, but in a really neat way. So I fell in love with it all. I had still been reading all this Lutheran stuff at my university. And for the briefest moment, I thought, maybe I should give up on this business administration degree, switch over to religious studies, and maybe I should go to seminary. This is really, for once, I find the faith very interesting. I thought that once. And then I thought, no, I don't want to do that. I see what pastors go through. I don't want to have to live with that. And so there I am at Epiphany Lutheran Church. I'm in the line to go out after the liturgy. And the pastor, I later find out, does something he always does. And he shook my hand. He said, this part he doesn't always do. He said, do I know you? And I'm like, no, this is my first time here. And I said, oh. Have you ever thought about going to seminary? That, and he asked everybody. Two things. How's your sex life? Can you imagine? How's your sex life? And have you thought about going to seminary? I was still, a recovering fundamentalist kid. You can't lie. You still shouldn't lie, even if you're not fundamentalist. That's a whole different lecture. It's nuanced and complicated. But so I said, I thought about it once. I said, yes. And so here I am. I went to visit Southern Seminary, and I had expressed my concerns both with my pastor, now at a Lutheran church, and at the seminary about the ELCA's growing openness to the, at the time, what we call gays and lesbians. Our language has developed the LGBTQ+ community. And I felt like that's still not right. And My pastor, when I asked him about that, he said, I just don't worry about that. I think it's between two people and God. This is in the 90s. Two people and God, and I just don't worry about it, as long as they're treating one another well. And I thought, that makes a lot of sense, but it's not the right answer. And then I got to seminary. When I first visited there, I was talking to the admissions director, and I said, again, same thing, I'm just not comfortable with where the ELCA is on sexuality. He didn't mean for me to see this, but I caught the look. It was like, and I ended up going to Southern anyway. I think in part because I had learned its reputation was that it was more theologically conservative at the time, and that it had a strong reputation of turning out like your parish pastor. That's really what they were trying to do, well-rounded parish pastor. So I went there, and I saw the conviction around good theology. And I saw a conviction there for well-grounded reading of scripture that wasn't kind of like the mechanical fundamentalist reading, but a real engagement with the Bible. And then I slowly discovered that 50% of these students who were wrestling to be the best theologians and best biblical scholars that they could be, 50% of them were gay. And I'm like, this doesn't make sense. Like, because if you're gay, you're supposed to not care about any of this stuff, right? You're just going to do whatever you want to do. You don't care what the Bible says. And then my best friend at seminary came out to me, and there I was. I had to make a decision. Well, what was I going to respond to her with? And I thought about my pastor, and I said, in the back of my head, I don't think I'm supposed to say this, but it feels like the right thing to say. And I said, it doesn't matter what I think, we are still going to be friends. And I just left it at that. Over the next couple of years, my mind was changed. And I wasn't ready to come out yet. But as far as my acceptance of others, it had changed. Not because we were just going to ignore the parts of Scripture that seemed like to address these issues, but that we were going to wrestle with them the same way that Jacob wrestled the angel in the dark, and the angel eventually cheated. Do you know the story? Mm-hmm. We cleaned up the translation a little bit. The angel took a cheap shot to get out of the wrestling match. The angel kicked him in the groin. That's what the Hebrew says. That's why he's limping. And so the angel takes this cheap shot to get out of the wrestling match. But before that, Jacob says, I will not let you go until you give me a blessing. That's how we read the Bible. I will not let you go until you give me a blessing. And so, like the character sheet not being described correctly in the book, I eventually came to realize that maybe they were getting sexuality wrong. I can go into more detail about that, but that's almost another presentation. But what I'll tell you is the chief sexuality presented in the New Testament is celibacy, abstinence. There's not enough time for you to get married and have kids. That's what Paul's telling his congregations. We have decided that we don't need to pay attention to that anymore. Because Paul was not right about when the second coming was going to happen, and that we needed to change. And we have built new sexual ethics based on love of God and love of neighbor, which are not what the New Testament was teaching, because it was time conditioned for a specific period. That's the kind of thing that we've continued to wrestle with on all kinds of questions about gender, sexuality, what do we do with wealth. It's all that question. We continue to wrestle with the Bible, not ignore it, but wrestle with it and ask for a blessing. Eventually, the thing that I had felt that I had suppressed in the back of my mind, that I was in fact gay, could not be quiet anymore. And even though I felt like I was disrupting a lot of lives, and that honestly I still carry a lot of shame about, because I have yet to go visit my alma mater, where I got married to a woman, because I was trying to escape being gay. We got married at that chapel. And so I have yet to go back because of a sense of shame that actually belongs to my fundamentalist past and not to that seminary. And I saw what me trying to be the kind of person that fundamentalism told me I needed to be, especially around sex and attraction. Because the thing is, being queer is not just about who you have sex with. I recently saw a meme that said, I don't understand why people are so afraid of queer community and queer culture when it looks like this. And the picture was Bert and Ernie sitting in the living room. I think Bert's eating popcorn and Bert's reading a book and Ernie's eating the popcorn. I experienced that with a friend of mine who has been openly gay for a long time and married. And they were in their mountain cabin, and it was on the news, and about marriage being available for same-sex couples. And I think in that case, he's knitting in one chair, and his husband is nodding off while trying to read a book with the news in the background in the other chair. And he's like, what are they so afraid of? I mean, look at us. Boring. So that part of me that said that wasn't right, and my attempt to live the way that I had been taught I ought to, was ruining people's lives, not just mine. Our marriage was becoming toxic. And it was just breaking a lot of things. And I thought, this does not look like Jesus, who said, I've come to bring life, and not just life, but life abundant. This is not abundant life. And so the first person I came out to was technically probably my friend, who I told, doesn't matter what I think, we'll always be friends. But really, it was my wife. Because of my convictions, we still did at least a year of couples therapy to see if I could fix this. And at the end of it, nothing was changing. And so we separated, we went our various ways, and that's part of how I ended up in Philadelphia. And I think all of us are much happier and living more abundant lives than trying to help me participate in what was fundamentally a lie. And as the church, I came here in the beginning of '09, thinking I was going to have to figure out a way we're in full communion with the Episcopal Church. They're more okay with people like me than at the time the ELCA was. If I was going to be a pastor, I probably would need to do it there. And then in August of '09, Churchwide Assembly made a decision that nobody was expecting them to make. And they said openly gay, lesbian pastors, because then again, that was still our language, can still serve as pastors where the congregation says it's okay for them to be. So all that you're probably more aware of than most audiences that I talk to. And just to see, because by the way, that seminary also had about 50% queer population. The kind of relief, and then to see what the kind of relief that congregations have experienced, and being able to say, we see holiness in the lives of these people. We know that they walk among us. We're friends with them. Some of them have even worked in our congregations. We have seen the normality and the holiness that exists in their lives and their relationships, and we would like to honor that. And the freedom, and I think ultimately adherence to the gospel that has allowed congregations to do has been marvelous. But one thing I'd say is don't expect that all of a sudden a whole bunch of queer people are going to come to your congregation. The church has done such a really good job at herding those people. They may come to a point where they're like, at least there's that church, and I'm okay with them being here, but I still can't go. I understand that with my own background. There was a long time, there were certain hymns that I would never let the congregation pick. Just as I am was one of them. I now pick that every Ash Wednesday. You know, healing can't happen. But there were certain hymns that I avoided. And so there isn't this healing also for queer people who feel comfortable in church, that they can experience a fullness of faith that has not been provided for them in the past. So that's my journey. There are times that still hurts. That's okay. Because there are now communities like this where I can be honest and open about that. That always contributes to my healing in that. And I think that's the point. For me, the basic ethical question is the question that Bonhoeffer asked, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lutheran pastor. We're often asked, like, what would we do in our Bonhoeffer moment? And there are some really good Bonhoeffer scholars that say, we should ask the question that Bonhoeffer asked, and that is, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And I think the more that we can ask that question and wrestle with the Bible as Jacob wrestled with the angel, asking, Jesus, who are you going to be for us today? It is the way to figure out what it means to be human. The way to figure out what it meant that God decided to become one of us to show us what it meant to be human. And while doing that said, I have come to bring life and to bring life abundantly. And I think that's what's happening for us now. Thank you. I should say I thrive on Q&As, so I think that's what we're going to do now. I'm glad you came up with the questions. I was trying to come up with a joke.
This question may sound like a joke, but first, thank you for sharing your story with us. It is beautiful.